23 years ago, at the age of 19, I shot and killed a man. I was a young drug dealer with a short temper and a semi-automatic pistol. But that wasn't the end of my story. In fact, it was the beginning. And the 23-year sentence is a story of acknowledgement, apology, and atonement. In today's world, when we hear the word felon, we usually use words like vicious, unkempt, and unredeemable to describe them. But these three words shouldn't be used because they're not accurate. A study in Johns Hopkins proved that 90% of men and women who are incarcerated are redeemable and at one point will return to their communities and cause a lasting impact. Part of this 90% is Detroit-born Shaka Senghor, who in March of 2014 held a TED Talk. And in his TED Talk, he tells his story of how he killed a man, went to prison for it, reflected on what he did while in prison, and has now re-entered society and is trying to keep others from making the same mistakes. Follow Shaka through his journey to prove Why Your Worst Deeds Don't Define You by Shaka Senghor. The actual events are pretty straightforward. At the age of 17, I got shot 3 times standing on the corner of my block in Detroit. My friend rushed me to the hospital. Doctors pulled the bullets out, patched me up, and they sent me back to the same neighborhood where I got shot. Throughout this ordeal, no one hugged me. No one counseled me. No one told me that I would be okay. No one told me that I would live in fear, that I would be paranoid, or that I would react hyper-violently to getting shot. No one told me that one day, that I myself would become the person behind the trigger. And 14 months later, at 2 a.m., I fired the shots that caused the man's death. When I entered prison, I was bitter, I was angry, I was hurt. I didn't want to take any responsibility. I blamed everybody, from my parents to the system. I rationalized my decision to shoot because in the hood where I come from, it's better being the shooter than the person getting shot. As I sat back on my bunk, I felt helpless, unloved, and abandoned. I felt like no one cared. And so I reacted with hostility towards my confinement. And I found myself getting deeper and deeper into trouble. I ran black market stores. I loan sharked. And I had sold drugs that were illegally smuggled into the prison. I had in fact become what the warden of the Michigan Reformatory called the worst of the worst. And because of my activity, I landed in solitary confinement for 7.5 years out of my incarceration. Now as I see it, solitary confinement is one of the most inhumane and barbaric places you can find yourself. But find myself, I did. One day, I was pacing in my cell when an officer came and delivered mail. I looked through a couple of letters before coming to the one that had my son's squiggly handwriting on it. Whenever I would get a letter from my son, it was like a ray of light in the darkest place you can imagine. And on this particular day, I decided to open this particular letter. And in capital letters, he wrote, "My mama told me why you was in prison. Murder," he said. "Dad, don't kill. Jesus watches what you do. Pray to him." Now, I wasn't religious at the time, nor am I religious now. But there was something so profound about my son's words that made me examine things about my life that I haven't considered. It was the first time in my life that I'd ever thought about the fact that my own son would see me as a murderer. As I sat back in my cold cell, I had thought about something that I had read in Plato, where Socrates stated in Apology that the unexamined life isn't worth living. It was at that point when a transformation began. What I realized was that there were 4 key things. The first being I had great mentors. Now, I know what some of y'all are probably thinking, Shaka, so that's great and all, but how did you find your mentors in prison of all places? Well, my mentors, who were serving life sentences, were some of the best people to ever come into my life because they made me look at my life with honesty and they forced me to challenge myself about my decision making. The second thing was literature. Prior to going to prison, I didn't know that there's so many brilliant black poets, authors, and philosophers. And I had the great fortune of encountering Malcolm X's autobiography, and it shattered every stereotype I had about myself. The third thing was family. For 19 years, my father stood by my side with an unshakable faith because he knew that I had what it took to turn my life around. And I also met an amazing woman who's now the mother of my 2-year-old son, Shaka, and she taught me how to love myself in a healthy way. And the final thing was writing. When I got that letter from my son, I began to write a journal about things that I'd experienced in my life and in prison. And what it did was open my mind up to the idea of atonement. Early in my incarceration, I had received a letter from one of the relatives of my victim. In this letter, she told me that she forgave me because she realized that I was a young child who had been abused and had been through some hardships and just made a series of poor decisions. It was the first time in my life that I'd ever felt open to forgiving myself. One of the things that happened after that experience was that I began to think about the men and women who are incarcerated alongside me. And they wanted help, and they wanted to turn it around. But unfortunately, the system that currently holds 2.4 million people in prison is designed to warehouse as opposed to rehabilitate. So I made it up in my mind that if I was to ever get released from prison, that I would change that. In 2010, I walked out of prison for the first time after 2 whole decades. It was the first time in my life that I was exposed to the internet, social media, and cars that talked like Kent from Knight Rider. But the thing that fascinated me the most was phone technology. See, when I was in prison, our car phones were about this big and required 2 whole people to carry. So imagine what it was like when I first grabbed my tiny little BlackBerry, started learning how to text. One of the things that I realized after being released from my imprisonment was that there were 3 things that I had to do. The first being acknowledgement. I had to acknowledge that I had hurt others, that I had been hurt. The second thing was apologizing. I had to apologize to the people that I had hurt, even though I had no expectations of them accepting it. But I also had to apologize to myself. And the third thing was atoning. For me, atoning meant re-entering my community and working with at-risk youth who were on the same path. Now, my journey is a unique one, but it doesn't have to be that way. We can all have a transformation if we make the space to do so. So what I'm asking of you all today is to envision a world where men and women aren't held hostage by their past, where misdeeds and mistakes don't define you. I think collectively, we can create that world. And I hope you do too.